They called it a will reading, but it felt more like a performance. One where every role had already been cast, every line rehearsed, and I was the extra who didn't make the final cut. My sister sat glowing beside our parents as the lawyer read the verdict they'd all been waiting for. A $5 million mansion in Savannah. Handed to her like a trophy. Then they turned to me, faces tight with politeness, and said a condo would suit me just fine. I smiled. Or at least I moved the corners of my mouth like a smile. Because that's what you do when you've already been erased. You don't cry, you don't plead. You hold your breath and hope they don't notice the pieces cracking inside you. But then, just as the silence settled back and the door opened, not loudly, just enough to make every spine straighten, a cane tapped against the hardwood floor, steady and certain. And there she was. Ruth Ellison. My grandmother. Wearing her church coat, clutching a worn envelope with my grandfather's handwriting across the front. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. The room shifted before a single word was read. Because deep down they knew what she was holding. The real script. The one they tried to bury. And I knew before the seal even broke that nothing would be the same again. Trent Caldwell, our family's long-standing attorney, cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. His voice was the kind that came from habit, not feeling. This is the reading of the late Dr. Raymond Ellison's estate as handled and consolidated through the Ellison family's prior directives. I barely heard the first few lines. My ears were too busy ringing. I hadn't heard Grandpa's name spoken aloud in a room full of suits since the funeral I wasn't invited to. Even now, a year later, his absence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. A year, and yet somehow no one had ever said his name without glancing at me like I didn't deserve to react. When Trent announced that the Ellison Beach house, estimated at just under $5 million, would be deeded solely to my sister Sloane, I didn't even flinch. I had already guessed. It was the way my mother's mouth curled slightly upward. The way Sloane sat straighter, like she had rehearsed this moment. She didn't blink. She didn't even say thank you. Trent continued reading. Several smaller accounts, investments, and personal properties were also allocated. Then came my name. Tamara Ellison, the family has agreed to transfer ownership of the Eastwood condo unit located in downtown Asheville, as well as a modest trust intended to supplement a lifestyle in line with her values. I stared at the wood grain on the table. My values. It sounded like a backhanded compliment and an insult wrapped in an apology. The condo. I had seen it once. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, street-level noise, no sunlight. Modest was a polite way of saying small. I didn't speak, didn't argue. I just nodded, signed the acknowledgement form with a pen that slipped slightly in my hand, and passed it back to Trent. Sloane looked over and tilted her head, a small smile tugging at her mouth. She had won, and we both knew it. Then, just as Trent was about to close the file and stand, the door to the conference room opened. Slowly. Intentionally. All heads turned. Mine last. She walked in wearing a dark navy coat and sensible shoes, holding a thick manila envelope in one hand and a cane in the other. Ruth Ellison, my grandmother, my father's mother. My grandfather's wife of over 50 years. No one had seen her in months. Elliot Monroe entered right behind her, carrying a leather briefcase and a presence that silenced the room. Sorry to interrupt, Charles, Ruth said, her voice crisp, unshaken. But I believe you're missing something. My father's brow creased. Mother stiffened in her chair. Sloane's smile faltered. Ruth made her way to the head of the table without asking for permission. Elliot stepped forward, placing his briefcase beside Trent's open file. Ruth set down the envelope. This is the final will and testament of Raymond Ellison. Dated March 12, 2021. Witnessed and notarized. Filed with Monroe Legal and held privately per Raymond's explicit request. It was to be opened only in the presence of family. Trent blinked, looked to Charles for guidance. My father said nothing. His lips were tight, skin pale. This is ridiculous, Denise muttered under her breath. Her hands were already fumbling for her phone. Ruth ignored her. Elliot opened the briefcase, removed a bound copy of the will, and placed it neatly beside the envelope. He glanced at me, not unkindly. Mara, it's good to see you again. I nodded. My voice had abandoned me. Ruth turned to the room. My husband knew the family he raised. He knew what might happen after he was gone. And he made arrangements to make sure every voice would be heard. She looked at me when she said it. And for the first time in years, I believed someone meant it. There was a stillness in the room that didn't feel like shock. It felt like exposure. Like someone had flipped a light on and the people at the table were scrambling to decide if they should shield their eyes or cover their tracks. I didn't know what the new will would say. I didn't know what it would change. But the envelope on that table was heavier than it looked. Not because of money, not even legacy, but because for the first time in a long time I wasn't the one being spoken over. And that all by itself was enough to make them nervous. They didn't say anything right away. No one reached for the envelope. No one looked at me, not even Sloane. The room just sat there quiet, pulsing with a tension that felt like the second before a storm breaks. I should have felt victorious or at least vindicated, but all I felt was tired. That night, I didn't go back to my condo. I drove aimlessly through the back roads of Asheville until I ended up on a familiar gravel path that curved around a ridge and opened onto a small clearing. The old farmhouse still stood there, weathered and soft around the edges, exactly as I remembered. The porch light was off, but the wind chimes were still hanging rusted slightly at the base but catching the breeze like they had when I was a girl. I parked under the magnolia tree and walked up to the door. Before I could knock, it creaked open. "Took you long enough," Ruth said, her voice as steady as it had been that morning, but quieter now, more personal. I stepped inside and immediately smelled lavender and cedar and the faint scent of old books. The living room hadn't changed. Same plaid armchairs, same Afghan folded neatly across the back of the couch. Same photo of Grandpa in his lab coat standing beside a 12-year-old me holding a plastic honeybee model with a crooked grin. "I thought you might be tired of that downtown box they handed you," Ruth said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Tea," I nodded, grateful not to have to explain anything. She boiled water while I stood near the fireplace staring at the dusty brick mantel. I hadn't been in this house since spring of 2021. A few months before everything changed. A few months before Grandpa died. I had tried to come back. I really had. "They told me you moved," Ruth said, suddenly back still turned. I looked at her. "What after Ray passed?" "Denise said you'd changed your number, left town, didn't want to be involved." I tried calling, but none of the numbers worked. My mouth went dry. "I never changed my number. I've had the same one since college." She turned and studied me for a long moment. Her face didn't shift much, but something behind her eyes darkened. "They said you didn't want to be found, that you were ashamed of us, of the way the family handled things." I didn't know what to think. She set the mugs down, her hand trembling slightly. I wanted to believe that wasn't true. "But when you didn't show up to the funeral..." I gripped the back of the kitchen chair. "The funeral was at noon," I said, my voice suddenly hoarse. "I was at the church before 11:30. The parking lot was empty." She shook her head slowly. "The service was at 9. My stomach dropped. "They told everyone you never came. Said you didn't even send flowers. That you didn't care." I leaned against the counter, the room spinning slightly. I would never have missed his funeral. Never. Ruth left the room for a moment. When she returned, she was holding an old leather-bound notebook. It was Grandpa's. I recognized it immediately. He used to jot everything down in neat square handwriting. Appointments, lab ideas, numbers. "He kept trying to call you near the end," she said, placing the notebook on the table. "Every day. He wrote down the number you gave him." I flipped to the last few pages. The digits were close, but not mine. Off by 2 numbers. A mistake someone might make if they were copying it by hand, or changing it deliberately. "This isn't my number," I said quietly. "Not even close." Ruth didn't respond. She just stared at the page for a long time before finally speaking. "Ray was confused the last few weeks, but never about you. He knew something was off, said he felt like he was being kept in a bubble. That people were managing him." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice level. "They isolated him, they isolated me. And they built a story in between so we'd both feel alone." Ruth sat down in the chair across from me, her fingers pressing lightly against the rim of her mug. Do you remember the day he took you to see that field trial in Blue Ridge? I nodded. I was 16. He let me collect data with his grad students. He told me that night you asked better questions than most of the PhDs. Said you didn't just want to know how something worked but why it stopped working. Why things failed. He always said you had that kind of mind. My throat tightened. I sat down slowly as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to me. I didn't know he was sick, I whispered. Not really. I thought he was busy or tired or just being distant. That's what they told me. I didn't even know when he went into hospice. She looked down, her voice suddenly unsteady. I should have called again. I should have come to find you. It's not your fault, I said. They made it look like I vanished. And maybe I let them. Maybe part of me believed I was easier to ignore than to include. She reached across the table and took my hand. Ray would be furious if he knew what they did. But more than that, he'd be disappointed they thought you'd just fade out. I didn't fade, I said. I was erased. We sat like that for a while, the old clock ticking in the corner, the wind pushing soft through the windows. It wasn't silence exactly, it was wait. The kind of quiet that comes after something breaks. Eventually Ruth stood and walked to a tall cabinet near the back hallway. She opened it, reached inside, and pulled out a sealed envelope. There's more, she said. And it's time you saw all of it. I looked at the handwriting on the front. It was his. The same blocky print that had labeled every beaker, every chart, every file in his lab. I didn't open it yet. I just stared at it, letting the truth of what had been kept from me settle deep into my bones. I had missed his funeral. His final days. His voice. But maybe, just maybe, I hadn't missed everything. I left Ruth's house just after sunset, the envelope tucked into my bag like it might burn if I held it too long. The sky was turning that deep gray blue that always reminded me of long drives with Grandpa, windows down, radio low. I didn't open the envelope that night. I wasn't ready to hold anything else that hurt. Instead, I drove back to the law office. The parking lot was mostly empty. Only 2 cars remained. One belonged to Trent, the other was Sloane's SLC. Her Lexus, pearl white and spotless, gleamed under the amber parking lights. I almost left, but something told me to stay. I parked a few rows back and cracked my window. The warm spring air drifted in thick with the smell of pavement and pine. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. I was about to start the car again when the side door opened. Denise stepped out first, her heels sharp against the concrete. Sloane followed, holding her clutch like it was armor. They didn't see me. I heard them before I fully registered what I was hearing. Denise was laughing softly, her tone light, triumphant. You did beautifully, sweetheart. Really. The way you handled that was perfect. Sloane's voice followed, just loud enough to carry across the lot. I stuck to the plan. Weekly calls, Sunday visits, checking in on his blood pressure, remembering to ask about the bees. She laughed. God, I hate bees. Denise reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's shoulder. But he loved hearing you pretend. That's what mattered. You showed up. That's more than Mara ever managed. I froze. Sloane leaned against the car and smiled, her voice tinged with something between pride and resentment. I almost slipped when he asked why Mara never returned his messages, but I told him she'd blocked us. That she moved away to some research fellowship and didn't want to be contacted. He believed me. Denise opened the driver's door. Of course he did. He wanted to believe the best in you. That was the key. He wanted someone to carry the legacy, and you made sure he saw what he wanted to see. Sloane hesitated, then said, he never looked at me the way he looked at her. Not when we were kids. But once she was gone, once we took her out of the picture, it was like I became enough. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Denise slid into the driver's seat. You are enough, baby. And now the family home is yours. Everything is as it should be. The door shut. The engine started. The car pulled away slow and smooth, leaving me sitting in the dark with a truth I hadn't expected to hear out loud. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about love. It was about control. They hadn't just wanted to punish me, they had wanted to replace me. Sloane wasn't born into my place. She was coached into it. Trained. Positioned. And I stupidly had believed for years that distance came from disappointment. That maybe I wasn't enough. That maybe I had failed them somehow. But standing there, heart thudding in my chest, I realized it had never been about failure. It had been about threat. I was inconvenient. Difficult to mold. Too curious. Too principled. I asked too many questions. And worst of all, I didn't perform. They had found someone who would. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Back at the condo, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I stood in the hallway, keys still in hand, and stared at the empty walls. This place was never a gift. It was a cage dressed in granite countertops and muted paint colors. A way to say, here's what we think you deserve. I sat on the floor, my back against the front door, and pulled out the envelope Ruth had given me. I didn't open it yet, but I laid it flat on my lap and just stared at my name in his handwriting. Not the name they'd tried to erase. Not the version they reshaped to fit a story. My name. Written by the only person who had ever said it with pride, and that at least hadn't been taken. The next morning, I drove back to the farmhouse. I didn't call ahead. I just packed the envelope into my tote bag, grabbed a thermos of black coffee, and headed out before the sun was fully up. The drive through Blue Ridge was quiet at that hour, the fog hanging low across the road like it hadn't decided whether to rise or not. Everything felt muted, as if the world was giving me space to breathe. Ruth was already outside when I pulled in, watering the stubborn patch of zinnias near the porch steps. She didn't act surprised to see me. "Thought you might come back," she said, without looking up. I parked under the same magnolia tree as the night before and walked up slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots. "Did you open it?" "Not yet," I said. She nodded. "Come inside." I made cornbread. Not the sweet kind. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like cinnamon and old wood. She handed me a plate and gestured toward the den. "It's all still here," she said. "His papers, his files, all those notebooks you two used to argue over." I followed her through the hallway to the study at the back of the house. I hadn't been in there since I was a teenager. The room was packed wall to wall with bookshelves and filing cabinets, most labeled in Grandpa's handwriting. The light filtered through lace curtains, casting soft squares on the floor. Ruth pulled open one of the metal drawers and began flipping through folders. Her fingers paused on one with a cracked green cover, then another with faded red tabs. "He kept a system," she said. "Color-coded. Green for research, red for estate, blue for family." I moved toward the shelf by the window and scanned the labels. One folder caught my eye, shoved between two thick binders marked soil samples. The tab was blue, but the writing had faded. I reached for it and pulled it free. It was thinner than the rest, dusty, tied with a rubber band that had long since dried out and cracked. Written across the front in neat, familiar print were the words for Mara. "Deliver before June 2021. My throat went tight. Ruth turned. "What is it?" I held it out to her. She took it, sat down in the armchair near the desk, and carefully removed the brittle band. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a letter addressed to me in full. The second, a set of architectural renderings. The third, a copy of a land deed. Ruth read silently for a few minutes, her brow furrowed deeper with every page. "This is..." She trailed off. "This is a full proposal. He wanted to build a research annex on the south plot, the one near the water table. For you. To run. Independently. He already submitted for zoning. The plans were approved." I took the letter from her and sat on the floor, reading slowly. Grandpa had detailed the kind of work he hoped I would do. Environmental testing, pollinator studies, soil resilience in microfarm environments. He even named the building the Ellison Annex for Ecological Research and Youth Education. He wrote about me like I was already leading it. He believed it could be done before the end of 2021. He had a timeline, a fund reserved through a family trust, and partnerships outlined with local universities. He had even included a budget for hiring 2 junior researchers. My name appeared again and again. Not as a footnote. As the center, Ruth reached for the deed, scanning the signature page. This is signed notarized. Why didn't I see this? You think Charles got to it? I asked, already knowing the answer. She set the folder down slowly. He had access to everything during those months. Denise too. I was only getting what they passed along. They told me the annex was too ambitious. That the city pulled back on zoning. I didn't question it. But now… She shook her head. I can't believe I didn't push harder. It's not your fault, I said. They wanted it buried. The weight of it all pressed down on me. Not just what was stolen, but what was almost built. What could have already existed. This wasn't just about family wealth. It was about being trusted with something that mattered. I had spent the last year thinking I was simply overlooked. But now I knew. I had been deliberately removed from my own future. He saw me, I said softly. He actually saw what I could do. Ruth looked at me with something behind her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Fierce, protective clarity. He always did. I sat back, surrounded by his handwriting, the smell of old paper and pine. Outside, the wind chimes stirred gently. Somewhere behind the shelves, a floorboard creaked like it had when I was a child. The pages in my lap didn't change what had been done. But they made it undeniable. I hadn't imagined my place in his world. They had just hidden it. Carefully, cruelly, and almost completely. Almost. It rained the morning we were called back to the law office. Not a thunderstorm. Just a slow, cold drizzle that slicked the sidewalks and turned the whole of downtown Asheville gray. I wore a black sweater under my raincoat and tied my curls back, not because I cared what they thought of me, but because I didn't want my hair in my eyes when it finally happened. Ruth insisted on driving. She didn't say much during the ride, but her knuckles stayed tight on the steering wheel the whole way. At the reception desk, the assistant didn't ask our names this time. She just nodded and opened the frosted glass door leading down the same hallway as before. Only this time Elliot Monroe was waiting. He stood as we entered, offering a brief nod. Mara. Miss Ruth. The others were already seated. Sloane, in a cream turtleneck, legs crossed tightly, arms folded, nails tapping against the armrest of her chair. Charles sat beside her, one hand gripping a thick umbrella like it might shield him from what was coming. Denise looked tired, older. Her gaze flicked toward me and then dropped. Elliot gestured toward the end of the table. Please take a seat. I sat. Ruth remained standing behind me. Thank you for coming, he said. I know this is unusual, but the request came directly from Mr. Ellison prior to his passing. He left instructions, very specific ones, regarding the reading of his final will and the delivery of its contents. Today, I will fulfill that obligation. He reached into his briefcase, removed a sealed envelope, and held it in both hands for a moment before breaking the wax. This, he continued, is the official last will and testament of Mr. Raymond Ellison, dated August 21, 2020. It supersedes any previous versions. Sloane shifted in her seat. Her lips parted just slightly. Elliot unfolded the pages and began. In it, Grandpa's voice came back. Formal, measured, but warm. He acknowledged his daughters, his grandchildren, the land, the years. He said he had seen potential and disappointment in all directions. That legacy was not something owed, but something earned and protected. And then it came. To my granddaughter Mara Ellison, I leave the entirety of the Blue Ridge property, inclusive of the main house, the greenhouse, and the south acreage. I also transfer full rights to the land use permit approved under application BRZ 113C for the Ellison Annex for ecological research and youth education. A sound escaped from Sloane's throat. A kind of half-laugh, half-scoff. Elliot continued. In addition, I allocate the full balance of the Ellison Academic Fund held in trust since 1984 to Mara Ellison for the continued support of research, fieldwork, and education in environmental sciences to be administered at her discretion. I felt Ruth's hand on my shoulder. Steady. Warm. The document went on. Minor bequests to local institutions, a foundation contribution. But when it came to the family business, the numbers were clear. The remaining shares of Ellison Holdings are to be divided evenly between my granddaughters Sloane and Mara. Sloane exploded. Number. Her voice cracked through the room like a slap. Number. Number. That is not what was supposed to happen. I was told. I was told that if I stayed with him, if I took care of him through the end, the company would be mine. That was the deal. She turned to her parents. You said that was the deal. Charles didn't move. His jaw clenched. Denise blinked quickly and picked at the seam of her coat sleeve. Sloane stood. You let me believe this. You told me Mara ran off, that she didn't want anything to do with the family. You said she abandoned him. Elliot cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. Sloane pointed at me. She left. I stayed. I cleaned up his pills. I handled the estate tours. I answered every late-night call. And now you're telling me he gave everything to her. The silence that followed wasn't even awkward. It was hollow. I looked at her. I didn't leave, I said quietly. I was pushed out. And you knew it. You don't deserve this, she spat. Maybe not, I said, but neither do you. Sloane's face flushed deep red. Her eyes flicked to the folder still lying open on the table, then back to Charles. Did you hide it? She demanded. Did you take the real will? What else did you lie about? Charles stood slowly. His voice was low and brittle. We thought we were protecting the family. Number. You were protecting your version of it, I said. Elliot folded the papers back into the folder. All directives will be carried out as stated. The assets will be transferred over the next 30 days. Mara, we will contact you regarding the trust account and property documentation. Sloane, your shares will be administered through the family office pending final signatures. Sloane shook her head, her fists balled at her sides. This isn't over. I stood. It is for me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel smug. I felt done. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean. I walked past the front windows, past the cars parked along the curb, and out into the street without turning back. I didn't go home. I drove north past downtown Asheville, past the old road that curved toward the hills where I used to hike with Grandpa Raymond on Sundays, until I reached Ruth's cottage by the old orchard. Her porch light was still on. She never went to bed early these days. Part of her never stopped waiting. She opened the door before I knocked. Her face was tired, softer than usual, but her eyes were alert. I stepped in without saying much. She didn't ask. She just poured tea and sat across from me like she used to after school when I was 10, when my mother forgot I had rehearsals and Sloane had flute lessons, and Ruth was the only one who ever showed up. He left things for you, she said after a while. Her voice was quiet, not surprised. You know that now? I nodded. There's something else. I wasn't sure before. But maybe it's time. She stood slowly, walked to the old filing cabinet in the hallway and opened the bottom drawer. A click. A pause. Then she pulled out a manila folder. It was thin, bent at the corners, and looked like it had been slipped under heavier files for a long time. Your grandfather went into the hospital for a few days in early April, she said. They told me it was routine. I visited once. He looked confused, not like himself. He tried to tell me something, but Denise arrived before he could finish. She slid the folder across the table. I opened it. There were copies of court filings. One of them was a power of attorney document dated April 12th. It stated that Raymond had granted full legal authority over his estate and medical decisions to Denise Prescott. It revoked all prior directives. I stared at the signature. It looked like his. But the more I looked, the less it felt right. The slant was too sharp. The loop in the Y was missing. This was never discussed with me, Ruth whispered. Not once. And I know he told me years ago that if anything happened, he wanted Elliot involved. Not Denise. Never Denise. I turned the next page. There was a hospital intake form from the same date. Raymond's mental status disoriented. A note scribbled in the margin: patient unable to recall date or current president. And yet he'd supposedly signed over his entire legal autonomy that same day. I picked up my phone and called Elliot Monroe. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the rain under Ruth's awning, my voice low but urgent. Elliot's tone shifted halfway through our call. That's a serious claim, he said. And a serious document. I've seen the POA in the case file. I assumed it was legitimate. Can you get it examined? I asked. Yes. There are analysts we trust. Handwriting, ink, age, everything. It might not be his, I said. Or if it was, he didn't know what he was signing. There was a long silence on the line. Leave it with me, he said at last. I walked back inside and sat beside Ruth, the folder still in my hands. I thought of how many times Grandpa had told me stories about standing firm. That doing the right thing might leave you lonely but never empty. And I thought of Sloane. At the office, she had screamed. Not cried, not pleaded, but screamed. The kind of scream that comes from something breaking. Not just plans, ego. A version of herself built on being the one who was promised everything. It was all slipping now. And it wouldn't stop with just property lines. Ruth broke the silence. He wasn't himself in April, she said. I remember because I brought him a quilt and he didn't know my name at first. Then he cried and said he didn't want to sleep anymore. Said they kept moving the window. What does that mean? I think he thought he was still in his old house. The one they sold years ago. He was scared. And I wasn't enough. You were there, I said. That made all the difference. She gave me a weak smile, then pointed to the corner of the folder I hadn't flipped yet. There was one more paper folded into thirds. An envelope taped to the back. I pulled it open and found a note. It was in his handwriting. Faded ink dated March 2nd. Mara, if anything happens and you don't get this in time, please ask Elliot about the spring folder. Tell him I was forced. I don't want this path, not for us. Love you, Grandpa. Our spring folder. I texted a photo of the note to Elliot right away. Within minutes, he called back. I remember that. Raymond had a set of seasonal folders color-coded. He kept them in a locked drawer. The spring one disappeared around May. Charles said it was lost during cleaning. But Elliot didn't sound convinced. If that folder had the original estate updates and this note confirms he feared coercion, it changes things. And the signature initial analysis suggests it may not be his, he said. One of our specialists thinks it resembles an earlier sample but lacks fluidity. They'll run it through comparative software. I knew what that meant. Sloane. Sloane had been copying his handwriting for years. Birthday cards, school forms, even excuse slips when she skipped piano. She was good at it. Not perfect, but good. Until now. I sat back and stared at the teacup in front of me, untouched, now gone cold. They hadn't just tried to erase me from the future. They had reached into his final moments and stripped away his voice. Silenced him with ink and lies. Ruth stood slowly and touched my arm. He wouldn't want you to drown in this, she said. He'd want you to carry something forward. Something he built for you. I nodded, but my throat closed tight. There would be time for strength later. Tonight I just needed to sit in that truth. And feel what it meant to be the only one left carrying his real story. The next morning I woke to a dozen missed calls and a silence in the house that felt sharper than sleep. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't scroll. But Ruth knocked gently on my door, her expression already telling me something had shifted. You should see this, she said, holding out her iPad. The screen showed the banner of a popular Asheville podcast, Morning Brew with Brenna. The thumbnail was unmistakable. Sloane in a soft cream blouse, lips painted like she'd rehearsed sincerity, sitting across from a host who practically beamed at her. I hit play. I've always tried to be there for my family, Sloane said, her voice breaking in all the right places. But when your sister swoops in after years away and suddenly claims everything from a vulnerable man, it's hard not to feel betrayed. The host leaned in, sympathetic. Your grandfather had been unwell, very. Memory issues, confusion. He was manipulated in his last months. We tried to protect him, but some people are relentless when money's involved. I turned it off. Ruth didn't say anything. Just placed a hand on my shoulder and left the room. Within hours the story had spread like spilled ink. Blogs, local news recaps, even financial sites picked it up. One headline read, "Missing granddaughter reappears just in time to inherit." Another, family rift turns ugly over multi-million-dollar estate. It wasn't just gossip. My inbox was flooded. Former clients expressing concern. A small think tank in Chicago I'd been scheduled to co-author a policy paper with. They emailed to say they were pausing all collaborations until the legal matters were resolved. The blow that landed hardest came from my university. I had just finalized a research fellowship with the Center for Policy Innovation. It was supposed to be my reset. A clean start. That morning, the director sent a terse note. Given recent publicity and potential litigation, we feel it is best to delay your involvement. We hope for resolution and clarity soon. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. By noon, a camera crew was parked outside Ruth's gate. She yelled at them from the porch, told them this was private property and to get off her gravel. They didn't budge. I turned off my phone and sat at the kitchen table. That's when the landline rang. Ruth answered, then handed it to me. "It's a Jonas Miller," she said. "Says it's important." I hesitated, then brought the receiver to my ear. "Hey Mara. Long time." His voice was a little deeper than I remembered, like the city had aged him slightly. I hadn't heard from him since we both left Chapel Hill. He'd taken the journalism track, I'd taken policy. We drifted the way people do when ambition and heartbreak don't blend well. "I saw the interview," he said. "You okay?" "Not really," I said. "But that doesn't matter now." "It does. Because I think she's playing a game. And I want to help you end it." I sat up straighter. "You're not exactly on the family Christmas list." "Exactly why I'm useful. I'm freelance now. I dig where others won't. And I've heard whispers that this whole POA and will situation stinks worse than a fish market in July. You think she doctored it, I think someone did. And I have a lead on a handwriting expert who used to work federal. Also, there's a nurse who was on rotation when your grandfather was admitted in April. She reached out anonymously. Said she was uncomfortable with how fast things changed that week. Why are you doing this? Pause. Because we used to dream of doing the right thing, remember, when the truth actually mattered. And I'm tired of watching people get steamrolled because they don't have a PR machine behind them. I didn't respond right away. Jonas broke the silence. "Let me send you a few names. And a timeline I've been building. You don't have to go public, but if you want this reversed, you're gonna need more than just outrage." I exhaled slowly. "Send it." Later that evening, a secure link arrived in my email. Jonas had already begun mapping out inconsistencies. The timeline of Grandpa's hospitalization. The notary who signed the POA had gone off the grid. A shell business that had received a large withdrawal from one of Grandpa's accounts matching the date Sloan hired a firm called Blue Leaf Strategies, a reputation management company. "That's who scrubbed her socials," Jonas said on a follow-up call. "They're good, but not perfect." I found an archive tweet from 3 months ago. She posted a photo with the caption, "My legacy isn't built, it's inherited." Real subtle. He chuckled. I didn't. I wasn't ready to laugh yet. Ruth knocked again that night, holding a letter. "This came today," she said. "No return address." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "We warned you." That was it. No name. No threat, technically. Just 4 words printed in block letters. Like something out of a bad drama. I looked at Ruth. She nodded, calm but alert. "We'll keep the gates locked. And I'm getting the camera reconnected." I wanted to say it was probably nothing, but I didn't believe that anymore. Not when I'd seen how quickly a podcast turned into a storm. Not when I knew how far Sloan would go to control the story. She had always been the golden one. The face, the voice, the curated image. I'd spent years in her shadow, and now that I'd stepped into the light, she was determined to drag me back into the dark. But I wasn't 12 anymore. And she didn't get to write the last chapter. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkened drive. I didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The next morning, I found myself awake before the sun, sitting at the edge of Ruth's old guest bed with my phone in hand, staring at nothing. The silence didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt suspended, like the moment just before thunder. An email pinged into my inbox from Jonas. No subject line, just a link and a note. "You need to hear this." Headphones. I plugged them in and tapped the file. The recording opened with static, then a muffled laugh. A woman's voice I didn't recognize at first, low and practiced trying too hard to sound casual. Then it shifted. Sloane. I felt it like a jolt in my spine. She was talking to someone, a woman named Piper, I gathered quickly. Probably a close friend or maybe a colleague she trusted. There was wine pouring in the background, the soft clink of a glass being set down. It was the kind of conversation people don't expect anyone else to hear. It wasn't my idea, Sloane said after a long pause. You know that, right? Mom had it all mapped out before Grandpa even got sick. PR school, family brand, public appearances. She said my art was self-indulgent. Said no one respects a daughter who paints. Piper murmured something, but Sloane kept going. I didn't fight it because I thought if I just did what they wanted, they'd love me more than they loved her. That maybe if I wore the right dress and smiled at the right events, they'd stop looking so disappointed all the time. There was a sharp breath, like she was holding back tears. But I never forgot the look on Dad's face when he said Mara was a mistake. Like she ruined the family's balance or something, and she just disappeared. And I couldn't risk that happening to me. I couldn't survive being erased like that. My chest tightened. I listened again to that part. Ruined. Played it twice. She didn't say she hated me. She didn't even say she wanted what I had. She was scared. Scared of being shut out. Scared of losing a place in a family that made love conditional. For a moment, I didn't know what I felt. Then I opened a blank note and started typing. I wanted to write her back. Not an email. Not a public statement. Just a letter. One woman to another. One daughter to another daughter. I typed slowly at first. You were never supposed to carry that alone. And then I know what it's like to watch them shape you like clay, then punish you when you dry wrong. Then I deleted the whole thing. Because as much as I felt something cracking open, I also remembered what had been done. The smear campaign. The inheritance maneuver. The public humiliation. Empathy did not erase consequences. Still, something had shifted. That afternoon, Jonas called again. You're not gonna believe this, he said, half out of breath. What now? Sloane tried to pull the podcast episode. Quietly. Her manager emailed Brenna's team last night asking them to archive or remove the interview due to potential defamation. I got someone on the inside to forward me the exchange. I blinked. They say no, hard no. Public figure, public claims. Unless she proves falsehood, it stays up. So she's feeling the pressure. Yeah, Jonas said. And guess what else? Her lawyer just filed a motion to seal the POA documents from public court records. That only happens when you're afraid of what people might find. I paused, letting it all settle in. She's cracking. She's human, Jonas corrected. And humans break in different ways. Some collapse. Others claw at the walls. That night I sat on Ruth's porch again, watching the stars blur above the hills. My thoughts felt layered. Not confused, just heavier. Like I was carrying two truths at once. One, Sloane had betrayed me. Two, Sloane had been betrayed too. It didn't absolve her, but it explained something. Maybe we were both the fallout of someone else's perfection project. Sculpted until we splintered. Inside, my phone buzzed. This time it was a text from Ruth. Upstairs, left you something. I padded into the hall and found a small envelope tucked under my bedroom door. No note, no name. Inside was an old photo. It was me and Sloane at a summer camp, maybe 10 or 11. We were both in oversized t-shirts, grinning with popsicles in hand. I couldn't even remember the day it was taken, but there we were. Not rivals. Not strangers. Sisters. It was the last time I remembered us looking happy at the same time. I stood there for a while, staring at the image, wondering how many layers had buried that moment. How many decisions had chipped away at it until all that was left was press releases and paperwork. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Revenge used to feel clean. But now it felt like walking through fog, holding something sharp, hoping I didn't cut myself worse than I'd already been sliced. I put the photo in the drawer beside the bed and closed it gently. Tomorrow I'd go back to Jonas with new questions. Not just about the will or the POA, but about the recordings. The old scholarships Sloane gave up. The abandoned art portfolios. The things she'd left behind just to keep her place at the table. And maybe, just maybe, the cracks in her mask weren't flaws. Maybe they were invitations. But not tonight. Tonight I needed to sleep, to dream without plotting. Because in the morning, I would ask myself the hardest question yet. What do you do with a sister who betrayed you when you finally see the part of her that broke first? I didn't have an answer. But I knew I couldn't carry her pain for her. Not anymore. The property was quiet when I arrived. Tucked into the edge of the Blue Ridge foothills, it was just as I remembered: dense trees surrounding the clearing, the air damp with the smell of pine and old wood. The building itself looked tired but intact. A long, low structure, more like a converted barn than a laboratory. Its metal roof was streaked with rust and vines had begun creeping up the back wall. But it was still here. Still standing. Just like me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. Dust shimmered in the beams of sunlight that pushed through the narrow windows. The furniture had been covered with white sheets, all slightly yellowed with time. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to the faint hum of electricity still flowing through the backup systems. The annex. My father's other legacy. His favorite one. 2 days later, Liam showed up with a truckload of supplies, and Isla brought her toolbox. She had a natural knack for fixing things, which worked well, because Liam mostly broke them. We started with the lab equipment. I replaced the air filters, cleaned the old centrifuge, and recalibrated the humidity sensors in the greenhouse. It felt good to move with purpose, to use my hands. Isla refitted the LED arrays above the seedlings, while Liam helped me rewire the solar backups. The annex began to breathe again, like a house waking up after a long sleep. We worked in silence most of the time. Not out of awkwardness, but out of a kind of reverence. As if speaking too loudly might disturb the spirit of the place. Dad had once told me science wasn't about answers. It was about questions you were willing to spend your life exploring. I hadn't understood it then. Now I did. On Friday morning, a silver Subaru pulled up the gravel road. A woman in jeans and a blue flannel shirt stepped out holding a brown paper bag. A girl followed her, no older than 13, carrying a plastic container with something inside that buzzed softly. "Are you Mara Whitaker?" the woman asked, smiling a little nervously. I nodded. "Depends on who's asking." She laughed. "I'm Helen Hart. This is my daughter Jenna. She's obsessed with bees." Jenna rolled her eyes in the way only a teenager could. "Mom means I'm interested in apiary science," she said, and handed me the container. Inside, nestled in mesh, were 5 honeybees crawling along a small comb. "They're Italian honeybees," she said. I isolated them because they seemed slower than the rest. Thought maybe they were sick. I read about mite infestations and wanted to test them. I blinked at her, then looked at the girl again. "You did all that yourself?" She nodded, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small spiral notebook. "I made this," she said, handing it over. It was a simulation of a research journal. Handwritten notes in colored ink, little diagrams of bee wings and pollen paths, graphs drawn in pencil. I opened to the first page and stared. At the top was written field study number 1. Backyard hive behavior. Beneath it, in blocky letters, "Inspired by Dr. Whitaker's paper on late-season floral patterns." My breath caught in my throat. "I used your paper for the baseline," she continued. "I know I'm not like a real scientist yet, but I thought maybe I could help with something here. I don't need money. Just experience." I was still staring at the journal. The handwriting. The format. It looked so much like mine when I was her age, even down to the way she had color-coded temperature fluctuations with red dots. A strange sound escaped me. A kind of laugh sob I hadn't expected. "Of course you can help," I said, blinking hard. "You're already better prepared than half the grad students I know." Her face lit up. Helen exhaled in relief. While they toured the greenhouse with Isla, I sat on the porch steps and flipped through the rest of Jenna's notebook. She had recorded seasonal nectar trends, hypothesized behavioral links between hive stress and microclimate variation, and even included a short ethics note about bee welfare. I ran my finger across the margin where she had scribbled a little heart next to the word pollination. Dad would have loved her. It occurred to me as I sat there that maybe this was the real inheritance. Not the deed. Not the labs or the name on the plaque at Wakefield. But the spark that passed from one person to another. The hunger to ask questions, to listen to what the bees were trying to say. Inside, Liam and Jenna were already arguing about pollen traps while Isla explained how to calibrate the light sensors. I watched through the dusty glass. It felt like watching something grow that didn't need me to control it. Later that afternoon, I started a new journal. Not a research log, but something else. A space to write freely without citations or deadlines. I titled the first page "What Remains." And then I wrote, "A girl with a notebook full of bees. A lab with dust on its windows. A sister who might still be more human than I thought." I didn't know where it would go, but it felt like a beginning. Or at least a place to start again. The next morning, a white envelope arrived with no return address. The handwriting on the front was careful, almost rehearsed. I stood by the mailbox for a while, turning it over in my hands like it might offer something more if I just held it long enough. Inside was a single piece of stationery from the hotel in Asheville where they'd been staying. The note was from Denise. "We are family," it read in that tidy cursive she'd picked up from Ruth. "We can't let money come between us. That's not what your father or I ever wanted. Please don't let it end like this." There was no apology, just a plea disguised as sentiment. I folded the letter slowly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't rip it. I didn't cry. I just placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it like it belonged to someone else. 2 days later, I got a text from Charles. "I'd like to talk, just us. Please." It was late afternoon and the annex was quiet except for the soft clicks of the greenhouse cooling system. Isla was working remotely for the day and Liam had driven into town to pick up parts for the irrigation pump. I sat on the back steps of the annex for a while, considering whether to respond at all. Eventually, I typed a message. "Tomorrow. 3 o'clock. The bench behind the lab." The bench had always been a kind of threshold space. Not quite inside, not quite outside. It sat beneath an old chestnut tree that had somehow survived the blight, its roots twisting through the soil like old secrets. It was where Dad used to sit with his notes, where he taught me how to identify pollinators by the sound of their wings. It was where I'd once believed something sacred could grow. I arrived 5 minutes early. Charles was already there. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment he looked older than I remembered. His khakis were pressed, and he wore a navy sweater I vaguely recognized from past Thanksgivings. He held no briefcase, no documents. Just his hands folded awkwardly in front of him. I didn't sit right away. I let him speak first. "Mara," he said softly, "I don't want to lose you." "You already did." He flinched just slightly, then nodded. "I know. And I can't undo that. But I'm asking for the chance to at least say I'm sorry. Not as a lawyer, not as your father. Just as someone who made the worst mistake of his life." I sat down slowly, keeping a deliberate distance between us. "What mistake are we talking about exactly?" He looked at the gravel path like it might offer him the words. "Erasing you. Letting Wakefield do what it did. Standing by while Denise, she's your wife. And you're my daughter." His voice cracked then just a little and I felt something tighten in my chest. I looked down at my hands. "When they came after me, you didn't call. When the press swarmed, you issued a joint statement. When I lost my career, you sent flowers. You didn't ask if I could pay rent. You didn't ask if I was breathing. You just disappeared." He nodded again, slower this time. "You're right. I thought I was protecting the foundation. I thought if I kept things quiet it would pass, but it didn't. And I see now that what I was really protecting was my own comfort." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "One of Dad's." He held it out to me. "This was your grandfather's final logbook. The last entry is about you. About how proud he was of the bee study you led. He called you his wildflower. Said you bloomed even when everything else was scorched." I took the notebook, gently flipping to the last page. The ink was faded, but the words were there. I remembered that summer. I remembered the look on Grandpa Henry's face when I showed him my charts, the way he'd whistled and said, "Well, I'll be damned, you've got the real stuff in you." I closed the notebook and placed it in my lap. "I'm not suing you, or Denise, or the foundation." His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "But I'm not coming back either." He looked up startled. "I'm not stepping foot in that building again. I'm not taking hush money. I'm not attending galas or smiling for legacy photos. I'm not part of that family anymore. Not the version you built." "Mara," I held up a hand. "I've given enough chances. You had a decade. I'm not angry, I'm just done. And for the record, I'm not asking for you to choose me over her. I'm asking you to accept the boundaries I'm setting now." He looked like he wanted to argue. Then his eyes shifted behind me. I turned and saw Ruth standing a few feet away, arms folded across her windbreaker, eyes sharp but not unkind. She didn't interrupt, just watched. Charles stood, his voice was low. "Thank you for meeting me. I hope someday you'll believe I meant that." I didn't answer. He turned and walked slowly back toward the parking area. I sat in the silence he left behind. The wind picked up, rustling the chestnut leaves. Ruth walked over, settling beside me on the bench. "He tried," she said plainly. "Not well, but he tried." I didn't respond. She tapped the armrest gently. "Your mother used to call this your dreaming bench. I remember." She smiled faintly, then looked straight ahead. "You've learned to hold your ground. Took you long enough, but it's yours now. That's what matters." We sat for a while saying nothing, just watching the light filter through the trees. Somewhere behind us, bees droned softly in the greenhouse. The annex was alive again. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe inside its walls without asking anyone's permission. Ruth stood after a while. "Come inside when you're ready. I've got lemon bread cooling." I nodded, still staring at the path. She left, her footsteps soft against the gravel. I stayed seated, notebook still in my lap, thumb pressed to the last page Grandpa Henry had written. A wildflower. That's what he'd called me. Maybe I'd finally started to believe it. The days grew shorter, and the leaves around the annex turned amber and rust-colored, like someone had swept a match through the forest and let it smolder gently. I had settled into a rhythm, the kind that doesn't ask for much but gives a quiet sort of peace in return. Morning check-ins with Isla, afternoon reviews with Liam, occasional walks with Ruth. The noise had faded. Not gone, but dulled enough that I could breathe through it. It was on one of those early October mornings when I first saw her again. I was on my way back from the greenhouse with a crate of early mums when I noticed a car pull up the gravel path. It was unfamiliar, a small silver hatchback with out-of-state plates. The driver sat still for a long time before stepping out. She wasn't wearing makeup. No lipstick, no foundation. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, strands falling around her face in a way that made her look younger than I remembered. No camera crew, no assistants. Just a soft gray sweater, jeans, and a folder tucked under her arm. Sloane. She walked slowly toward the annex, looking around like she was remembering something. I didn't move. I just set the crate down and waited. She stopped a few feet away and took a breath. "I don't want to take much of your time," she said. "I know I've already taken more than I ever deserved." Her voice wasn't the one from press conferences or gala stages. It was softer, uncertain, the kind that didn't expect to be listened to but tried anyway. I nodded once. Not cold, but not warm either. Just present. "I came to ask something, not for me. For the kids we work with now. We're starting a new module, public speaking, confidence. I thought maybe you could help guide it." I didn't answer right away. She looked down. "They listen to you, Mara. They always did. And not just because you're smart, because you made them feel like they mattered. I was never good at that." My hand rested on the wooden crate. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees behind us. Finally, I said, "What do you need?" Her eyes lifted slowly. "Just a simple curriculum, something they can start with. Stories maybe. How to stand. How to breathe." "I can do that." She nodded, almost surprised. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd even look me in the eye." I looked at her then. Fully. I haven't forgotten Sloane. I know. But I'm not holding it like I used to. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she stepped forward and held out the folder. It's just some rough ideas. Exercises, topics. I figured even if you said no, I'd leave it anyway. I took it, and as I did, she didn't let go right away. I still think about that night. What I said, what I didn't say. And I'm sorry for both. I let the words settle. I didn't rush to fill the silence. She let go of the folder and stepped back. I'm not expecting a second chance. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be different. She turned and started walking toward her car. The trees overhead dropped a few leaves onto the gravel, soft little pats against the earth. Before she got in, she looked back one more time. The program starts next week. But no pressure, just thank you for even listening. And then she was gone. I stood there for a while with the folder in my hands. It was warm where her fingers had held it. I brought it inside, set it on my desk, and opened it. The first page was titled Presentation Tips for Introverted Students. There were bullet points. Icebreakers. Silly warm-ups involving tongue twisters and shadow puppets. Nothing fancy. Just the kind of things we used to invent when we stayed up late planning workshops back in grad school. The second page was a lesson outline. Week 1 through 4. Practice topics, confidence drills. Room layouts to make kids feel less exposed. Hand-drawn sketches of a circular seating plan. I flipped to the back and found a section labeled Role Models. There in her careful handwriting was a single paragraph under my name. Mara Whitmore, co-founder of this space, is the reason I ever believed kids with soft voices could lead. She built this foundation long before we had donors or staff or logos. If I could teach half as clearly as she listens, I'd consider it my life's work. I stared at the words for a long time. My name. In her handwriting. Not followed by a press release. Not linked to a scandal. Just a simple truth she'd chosen to write down. I closed the folder and placed it beside my chair. Later that afternoon, I brought it to Isla. I think I'll lead the first few sessions, I told her. She raised an eyebrow. Something's shifting, I think maybe I'm just finally steady. She smiled and patted my shoulder. About damn time. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile and watched the sun sink behind the ridge. The sky turned a deep violet, stars beginning to blink awake. Somewhere inside, Ruth was humming as she chopped vegetables for stew. I thought about the kids who'd walk through our doors next week, nervous and fidgeting, clutching papers they wouldn't know how to read out loud. I thought about my own hands trembling years ago behind a podium at a state science fair and how Grandpa Henry had mouthed the words, "You've got this," from the crowd. Maybe this wasn't forgiveness. Maybe it wasn't even healing in the full sense. But it was something. A place to begin again. June in San Diego smelled like salt and citrus. I stood under a soft wash of stage light, the auditorium quiet as the host read my name. The National Award for Innovation in Community Science Education shimmered faintly in his hands as he handed it to me. I smiled, not for the cameras, but because I could still feel the worn edge of Grandpa Raymond's pocket watch pressed gently against my chest, tucked in the inner pocket of my navy blue suit. The photo inside 10-year-old me grinning beside a clunky bee habitat made of recycled yogurt containers was still safe beneath the glass. They asked me to speak. I kept it short. Thank you for recognizing what community can look like when we listen to the quiet kids. The ones who build bee houses and question rainfall and wonder why the soil tastes different near the fence. This award belongs to every student who dared to ask why and every mentor who didn't answer too quickly. The applause was kind. Not thunderous, not theatrical, just warm. The kind of applause that lets you leave the stage with your dignity and your soul intact. After the ceremony, I flew home, not to the sleek apartment offered in San Francisco by the university or the fellowship position in D.C. I flew back to Spring Hollow, to the annex where the rosemary spilled over the fence and the red-winged blackbirds nested in the old oak by the drive. When I stepped out of the taxi, the door burst open before I even reached the porch. Miss Mara Jenna sprinted toward me, holding a piece of paper over her head like a torch. I got it. The ecology scholarship. They're flying me out to Oregon next month to study pollination cycles. She threw her arms around me before I could speak. Her shirt smelled like paint and lavender, and there was a smear of soil across her cheekbone. That's amazing, I finally said. And exactly where you're meant to be. She pulled back, grinning. I used your trick in the interview. The breathing one. I imagined I was a bee looking for the quietest flower. Worked like magic. Ruth stood on the porch watching with a mug in her hand. She gave me a little nod, the kind that said, "See, this is what all of it was for." Ruth had moved into the little apartment behind the annex in the spring. Said she wanted to be closer to the morning sun and farther from her ringing landline. Every morning now, she brewed coffee for both of us, strong for her, herbal for me, and sat on the back steps reading the newspaper out loud to whoever passed through. She still wore her boots and still refused to label the spice jars in the kitchen. But her laugh had softened. Inside, the kids had decorated the main room with streamers made from recycled paper. On the whiteboard, someone had drawn a cartoon bee wearing a graduation cap. A note beside it read, "Welcome home, Queen of the Hive." I stayed up late that night sorting through a new batch of program proposals from Isla and Liam. They were good. Thoughtful, measured. The kind of things I used to dream of doing when I was just starting out. Around midnight, I stepped out into the yard. The stars blinked above me, the old wind chime over the greenhouse singing softly in the breeze. I walked to the edge of the property where the soil used to be dry and cracked from years of neglect. Now it pulsed with green sunflowers, milkweed, wild peas. And kids. Kids with notebooks. Kids with measuring tape and plastic containers whispering to each other about soil pH and butterfly sightings. One girl crouched near a patch of goldenrod. She had long braids and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Do you know what that one is?" I asked. She looked up. Her name tag read Aria. "I think it's a kind of goldenrod," she said. "But I'm not sure which species yet. I'm gonna look it up in the chart." She paused, then tilted her head. "Did you used to be a scientist?" "Still am," I said. She grinned. "Cool." I watched her turn back to her chart, legs folded under her like a little scientist monk. Then I walked back inside. Later that week, I sent in my official decline to the DC Fellowship. I didn't send a speech or an essay. Just one sentence: I'm needed where roots matter more than spotlights. There are days I still think about what I could have done differently. If I had spoken up earlier. If I had fought harder for that seat at the table before it got pulled out from under me. But then I see the kids sitting cross-legged in a garden that used to be a parking lot. I see Ruth shaking her head as she tastes Isla's latest attempt at lentil soup. I see Liam fixing the faucet with one hand while reviewing climate grant paperwork with the other. I see Sloan emailing me new resources at 2 a.m. titled "Only Try This Next." I see Jenna in the corner of a local newspaper holding a mason bee in a jar and teaching a class of third graders about pollination. And I realize, this is the table. Not a boardroom. Not a gala. Not a podium under hot lights. This is where it happens. In the quiet. In the dirt. In the choices that don't make headlines but make a life. Grandpa Raymond used to say a legacy isn't a mansion. It's a map. Drawn with choices. Colored in by kindness. Marked with the fingerprints of people brave enough to ask why. And this place, this imperfect humming dandelion-strewn patch of earth, is mine. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If Mara's story meant something to you or reminded you of your own questions, your own maps, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below, like the video, and hit subscribe to join me for more stories just like this one. The kind that start in the smallest places and lead us home.